Hola, buenas tardes, welcome. We have today our last session of this seminar on democracy and and diversity, and we'll have a marvelous ending of this of a seminar because we have a very distinguished political science professor from the University of Tallinn in Estonia, who is an expert on populism, but she has mainly worked on how populism really connects with diverse minorities. Would you say so? and that's what she's going to tell us about. I'm sure we all will be delighted to hear it because she will present research that her group has been developing for about 4 or 5 years, right? More or less. So in that sense, I think this is new to most of us, and I guess it will create a lot of comments, not just this evening here in this place, but also among the political science community. As you know, populism is really the subject that is being mostly studied nowadays. So thank you very much for coming. Mari-Liis, it's really a pleasure to have us with us. I met her 10 years ago when she was almost a student, almost. And I saw her again at her place, you know, in Tallinn, in a conference on populism, of course. And so in that sense, it's also a pleasure for me to meet her again and having the chance of cooperating with her and her country. Okay, the floor is yours.
Okay. Buenas tardes. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to be back in Madrid. We met with Fernando the first time in 2014. And why I said no is I had defended my PhD thesis 1 month earlier, so it was a very important distinction that I wasn't a student anymore. I was a fully fledged scholar by then. So I'm very grateful to Fernando and to Ile also for welcoming me here, and I'm happy to share some of our research, which is still ongoing. And since the topic of the whole series is democracy and diversity, then I decided to focus my presentation mainly on how populism and identity politics relate to one another, and ask a kind of provocative question for a provocative project, since my main focus these days is on the populist radical right, whether the people that the populists construct and address is becoming more plural. So my background is kind of in 2 different disciplines. On the one hand, I've been working a lot in migration studies. My PhD project was also on the citizenship identity of transnational migrants. And one group I was studying was Estonian migrants who had migrated to Finland, and how they maintained contact with Estonia and how they made inroads into the Finnish society. And on the other hand, I had become interested in populism studies around 2012, which was when these big debates were like only beginning. So it's been interesting to see how the discipline has developed over time. And as Fernando also said, my interest in this topic started around 2018, when I was invited to a conference which was focused on political parties abroad and how they try to attract the diaspora vote, or vote of migrant voters. And earlier I had noticed an interesting phenomenon. The Estonian diaspora in Finland, who I had studied, in there, an Estonian populist radical right party, which is called EKRE, had started a transnational branch organization. So Estonians who were living in Finland were joining a radical right party. And I thought that this is interesting. This is an anti-immigrant party. It's a Eurosceptic party. And yet, they are finding supporters in this group. So how could we explain this? Like, what is this phenomenon about? And then for the book that an edited volume, which we did on the topic, I conducted interviews with the activists in Helsinki and also with the party elites and tried to explain the phenomenon. And when I was presenting in conferences, I had colleagues come up and say, like, this is really interesting and really odd, but you know, we have the same thing. So it turned out that populist parties were making inroads into diaspora politics in many countries. And in the end, we ended up writing a joint paper with my colleague Sebastiano Pérez Terguero, who's also here, and Ingi Öykü Rodeborg, where we looked at the Estonian-Finnish case, but also the AKP, or the AK party from Turkey, which has a considerable supporter base in Germany, among German, Turkish diaspora in Germany. And the third case was a very different case, but the Ecuadorian Alianza País and Rafael Correa were very actively campaigning also here, among the Ecuadorian community in Spain. So we had three different types of politicians who could be classified as populists, you know, trying to go for the diasporic vote or the migrant vote. And so we wrote a paper that the migrants can also become the people. Then I started keeping like an irregularity file, because it wasn't just immigrants who were voting for populists back home, but I also started to notice that in some countries you might also have people who have immigrated to that country supporting populist radical right parties. So one interesting example is the AfD party in Germany. And there they have a pretty large Russian-speaking community who mainly, they remigrated to Germany in let's say in 1990. And around 2017, 2018, they really started to support AfD, and especially its anti-immigrant messaging. Moving on, we have some pretty recent examples from the most recent US presidential elections. So there has been a campaign of Latinos por Trump in the United States, also in previous election cycles, and this has continued. But this time around, Trump also started gaining support among young black men, or African-American men. And also Muslim Americans, like not all of them, but there was a small section who kind of conducted a support campaign for Donald Trump. And I mean, Trump has in the past vilified both Muslims. He was promising to implement the Muslim ban in the United States. He has called Latin Americans all sorts of horrible names, and so on. But yet, you have like certain segments in these groups who support this politician. Moving on, I understand you know Spanish politics way better than I do, but I've heard of examples here as well. So there is a kind of a support campaign by the Vox party, which is called Latinos por Abascal. You have a similar phenomenon in Portugal, where the Chega party is also campaigning among the Brazilian community in Portugal. Marine Le Pen was, I think, the first radical right politician who was able to bridge the gender gap. So women have in the past have not been very supportive of radical right parties, so men are in an overwhelming majority. But for the Rassemblement National, they managed to kind of increase the support among female voters. AfD has also kind of used LGBT people in their campaigns. This campaign ad reads that my partner and me find no worth in becoming acquaintances with Muslim immigrants because for them, our love is a deadly sin. So we see kind of like an appeal to LGBT voters as well by the radical right party. And so on. And of course, the media, they love these stories, right? So you have quite a lot of coverage about the Sweden Democrats, for instance, an anti-immigrant party in Sweden, who has allegedly been campaigning among migrant voters or people with a migration background and allegedly winning their support. The numbers, the statistical studies don't support that, so we don't have evidence that there would be overwhelming support for these parties and these groups. But still, you know, it's a very interesting story to tell. And the same is also for the Netherlands, where the party of Geert Wilders, the Freedom Party, has been claiming to enjoy high support among people with migration backgrounds. And after the last general election, I think Geert Wilders even thanked Muslim voters for their votes, which kind of caused a sensation. In a way, of course, this was not supported by post-election studies, which showed that he was definitely not a highly popular candidate among the voters in the Netherlands with a Muslim background. But nevertheless, it seems that these parties are trying to reach out to these voters. So, what is odd about this picture? It probably sounds odd also from like everyday knowledge background, but we can also take the academic definitions of what we consider the populist radical right here in parallel and kind of do a little comparative exercise. So, I understand that words like populist or radical are often used as offenses in politics. So nobody wants to, be called the populist or the radical, right? So I'm not using these words in a way to attack politicians. These are also concepts which are used in political science. And so what do you need to be in order to be called a populist radical right politician or party? And in essence, there are three core criteria. The first one is nativism, which basically states that nations or states should be inhabited exclusively by the members of the native group. So basically, non-native elements, foreign ideas, or immigration, this is considered as abnormal or undesirable, bad, threatening. Secondly, the populist radical right tends to be authoritarian. And this doesn't mean that they want to abolish all of democracy, but rather that they have an authoritarian mindset in the Adornoan sense. So meaning that, you expect there to be order in the society. There is a normal way how to live or how to behave. And then there is the deviant way. And any kind of deviance should be discouraged, even better, punished. So it's a very law and order type of idea. And everybody should live orderly lives in a way as prescribed. And thirdly, populism. This has been kind of like a partly liberating influence in the populist radical right, I would say. So populism is an idea which says that there is a fight between the good people, who are usually downtrodden in the society, and the bad elites, who have their own ideas about how things should be run, and who impose their order on the people. And the populists believe that the power should be given back to the people. And put, let's say, the will of the people, volonté générale, above rule of law, for instance. So, when I talk about populist radical right parties, then I talk about parties which share this type of ideology. They might have many differences, for instance, in their economic program, or, I don't know, educational program, whatever, but these are the core 3 features which they share. Since my topic today is populism and identity politics, then it's probably useful to also introduce a little bit of the debate which is going on around populism studies and in populism studies. So it's a bit of a slippery concept, and it has been defined in different ways. I understand Fernanda Vallespin has also provided a definition, which I think encompasses well both of those, which I have chosen for today. So I would say that the main disagreement or clash in populism studies these days is between those 2 gentlemen. Cas Mudde, whose background is actually in extreme right studies. So he has been studying like neo-fascist, post-fascist, right-wing populists, and so on for a long time. And then Ernesto Laclau is an Argentinian thinker, a left-wing thinker, and who has mainly focused on left-wing populism. So in the broad concept, they agree that there is a Manichaean distinction between the morally virtuous, the good people, and the bad elites. And the bad elites, need to be overthrown, and the will of the people ought to be restored, according to populists. But they kind of differ in the nitty-gritty, as usual. So one big debate is over whether populism is an ideology, or whether it's a discourse or a discursive strategy. So Cas Mudde has defined populism as a thin-centered ideology. So it's an ideological feature. It features in different policy proposals which the populist politician makes. And he says that populism alone cannot stand up. So it always needs like a host ideology, whether it's socialism, then you get like a left-wing populist, or nationalism, and then you get a right-wing populist. Laclau, on the other hand, says that a lot of the populists don't seem to have any ideology. So it's wrong to call it an ideology. They seem to be opportunistic, and they are constantly redefining who the people is that they are representing. So he says that the people is an empty signifier. Like the politician keeps, talking to different groups. Like, I don't know, when a politician talks to businessmen, then it's like constructing the people in one way. When it's talking to an ethnic minority, it's constructing it in another way. When it's talking to students, it's constructing it in another way, and so on. And in the end, he's kind of trying to bring those different groups together. Businessmen was maybe a bad example, so they are usually not the downtrodden, right? But small business owners, for instance, right? And so the strategy of the populist is to appeal to different groups, bring them together, and then to kind of like overthrow the hegemony of the ruling elites, like put a new power in place instead. So when we talk about whether the people is becoming plural, then it's pretty easy to see that according to Mudde, it's hard to achieve, because in his definition, the people is homogeneous, because the populist doesn't really define who the people is, right? Whereas for Laclau, it seems to be pluralist. It consists of different groups with different interests and needs and wants. So I would argue that populism does allow a sentiment of pluralism in it. But there are also limitations, so I will come back to those a bit later. Another core concept in the title of my talk is identity politics. So this is an idea which was born somewhere in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And it was a very progressive idea, so not much to do with the radical right or populists, but rather with people and movements and thinkers who wanted to emancipate different disadvantaged groups in the society, ethnic or racial minorities or women, for instance. And so they argued that while the emancipation strategies of the past had very much focused on taking down the barriers for individuals, then now we should deal with like the group level. So for instance, I'm a woman, so according to them, a part of like a disadvantaged group, because in the past, you didn't have many university professors who were young women, right? And you might say that I got into this position simply because I personally was able to go to the university, continue my education, get a PhD, and I was so good that I could also work, at the same time when I was having children, right? And I alone could do it. But identity politics says that the society as a whole ought to understand that women are disadvantaged because they have higher care duties in the society. So it's harder to have a career in the academia because you need to take care of your children, your husband, your parents, and so on. And the identity politics paradigm said that the whole society should understand that the playing field is like uneven, and then we should have measures which allow women to progress professionally as well. So it is, I would say, a very progressive idea, and it kind of acknowledges that the society is pluralist and has nothing to do with radical right ideas, right? But in a way, the radical right is kind of implemented some aspects of both identity into how they reach out to the world, as also shown in some of the examples earlier. So basically, the focus of, or the key questions which I've been asking, is that whether that the populist radical right is becoming more pluralist, more diverse over time. And does that mean that the populist radical right is becoming more tolerant, more mainstream, more emancipatory, taking on the ideals of identity politics, or not? In short, my argument is that they are becoming selectively inclusionary. So they're not including everyone. And while they accept like de facto pluralism, that societies consist of different groups with different needs, they are kind of using this in their campaigns, in their mobilization strategies, but they are not doing the equilibrium searching which classical pluralism is doing, where you acknowledge that all groups in the society are equal and we should have a debate or a dialogue to find a way which is the most suitable for the different groups in the society. And let's get back to some examples, right? I saw somebody yawning, so enough of the theory for the moment. Let's get into some examples. And I'm going to bring examples today from my native Estonia, which is the case I know best, and then also from the Netherlands and Sweden. So in Estonia, as I mentioned, there is a political party called EKRE. Here is one of their campaign posters. It says, "Save Estonia." It uses the national flag colors of Estonia, blue, black, and white. So a very patriotic party. And in the past, this party has been very anti-Russian. So Estonia has a sizable Russian minority. It's above 30% of the whole population are Russian speakers. About 27% of them are consider themselves ethnic Russians or identify as Russian. And since Estonia sits on the border with Russia, it has been occupied by the Soviet Union, then there are certain anti-Russian sentiments. There were already before the war in Ukraine started. And EKRE has also been kind of securitizing the Russian-speaking minority in Estonia. So they have this discourse about the fifth column, that the Russians are a security threat, which is directed from the Kremlin in Moscow and is a threat or a danger to Estonia's independence. And this quote comes from 2018. 3 years onwards, this is what you get. So this is already not in Estonian, this is a newspaper in Russian, a campaign newspaper for the same EKRE party. And here you again have the Mart Helme. By then he was a former chairman, but one of the key spokespersons towards the Russian-speaking community, because he has been the Estonian ambassador in Russia, so he speaks good Russian and knows a lot of Soviet time anecdotes and jokes and relates really well to this auditorium. And here they are, kind of trying to convince the Russian-speaking voters in Narva, a border town, about how dangerous the environmental agenda of the European Union is and how their children are going to be threatened by LGBT propaganda in schools. Another example comes from the Netherlands. So they have, the Netherlands is a very interesting country. They have a lot of parties and they also have a lot of populist parties. So this is just one of them, which could be classified also as populist radical right. It has been very anti-immigration. But there was a really odd and interesting example of where the party chairman, Thierry Baudet, appeared on a Muslim cooking show where different celebrities were sharing their recipes to celebrate the end of Ramadan. And the third example comes from Sweden and does not involve migrant voters, but LGBT voters. I would say that this is like the most, when the Forum for Democracy is like the most unusual case, then this is maybe the most kind of expected case to be reaching out to LGBT voters. As you can see already, the visual image of the party is somewhat different from the earlier examples. And this party proudly has LGBT people who identify as part of sexual minorities in their ranks, and has in the past also participated in the pride parades. They don't do that anymore because they were banned by the LGBT representation organization there a few years ago. And what do I want to show with those examples? Is something which we have started calling side streaming. So the argument which we are working on at the moment is that the populist radical right parties are trying kind of performing outreach, not necessarily reaching out, but performing outreach towards increasingly diverse groups without altering their fundamental ideological beliefs. And they are doing this with two goals in mind. The first is to reach out to those minority voters who hold beliefs which are similar to those parties, so who have either populist or authoritarian mindsets, and kind of get them into their voter base. The other, and I think maybe even more important reason is that by reaching out to minority groups, this allows them to legitimize themselves, to look as, or appear less threatening, less extreme to the voters in the majority group. We also argue that there are at least 4 strategies which they use when doing so. So these are bartering, depoliticization, placation, and erecting hierarchies. So what do we mean by that? Bartering is basically when you have a populist radical right party reach out to a minority group and say, look, we don't agree on everything, but there are some common interests which we might have. And I think this is a very good example of this, which Thierry Baudet used on the cooking show, where the dialogue was pretty conflictual. It wasn't easy watching in a way, but he says that he thinks that, okay, you might not like us, but we have some common interests. So, for instance, the Muslim community in the Netherlands also doesn't understand why the Netherlands should be a part of the Ukrainian war or fight any other American wars in Libya or Syria or Afghanistan or Iraq. So he is kind of like dipping into the anti-Americanism among Muslims, which is like a dominant idea also in many Muslim majority countries. Secondly, you also think that life is becoming increasingly unaffordable, so you're worried about price increases. And thirdly, you are not fans of that woke stuff either. And I understand that you already know what the woke stuff is. So, you know, we have something in common, right? But there is a big but. So the Muslim voters in the Netherlands or anywhere don't have that short memories, that they can't remember that this party has been depicting them as a threat, you know, to security, to cultural integrity, and so on. So you need to depoliticize that earlier conflict a bit. And here Baudet says that I was never a supporter of that mass immigration, to put it lightly. I think it has caused a lot of tension and problems, but I don't think that you are to be blamed for that. It wasn't your plan to come here and burden the society here with all sorts of problems and hassle. There are all sorts of forces at work in the world, and that has put the world on edge. So basically, he is distancing both himself and his party, and also the Muslim community, who is often scapegoated for different societal problems, from that conflict. So yeah, let's try to live together. Can't we just live normally without those differences, or with those differences? Sorry. Thirdly, placation. So in order to look more minority-friendly, many populist radical right parties also have candidates from those minority groups. So here you have some activists of the EKRE party in the Narva branch who are Estonian Russians. As I already mentioned, you have different LGBT politicians in the Sweden Democrats Party. Here you have Bo Broman, who is the party's, I think he's their treasurer or a finance specialist. He has also been responsible for developing the party's social and cultural policy. And a former member, Johan Nissinen, who later left the party, but has also publicly identified as queer. And then you have like other discursive strategies, which are about erecting hierarchies between either this group that the populist radical right party is trying to appeal to and some other groups, or the good and the bad within that group. And in some cases, they also use positive language, so they are just, you know, not talking about the threat, but celebrating this group in a way. So, some examples. So this is an example of intragroup hierarchies, where we have EKRE talking about the good Russians and the bad Russians in Estonia. So there are Russians in Estonia who share our values and conservative views, Russians whom our patriotic theses are not stroking the wrong way. But there are also those other Russians with chauvinistic views, so Russian chauvinistic views. It will be much more difficult for them to keep up with us. But the Russian voter in Estonia has become more versatile, and I think this is very good. So they kind of finish on a positive note, right? So they're not trying to appeal to every Russian. There are also the bad ones who won't vote for them, but you know, there might be some good ones in their discourse. Or then, as framed by Jimmy Åkesson, the chairman of the Sweden Democrats Party, we represent homosexuals who do not live their sexuality, but live completely normal Svensson lives and are happy with that and don't want to kind of show their sexuality to the society. So there is a good group that they are appealing to, which is conservative in their values, and then there are those others that you don't need to be concerned about. There has been some literature on how different groups are being pitted against one another. And a very prominent example is by Jasper Boer, who was investigating the political discourse, for instance, in the United States as well, where basically the, let's say, Islamic culture and cultural rights of Muslims and LGBT people were pitted against one another, saying that, you know, in conservative Islam, LGBTQ people don't have any rights. So you are being threatened by Islam or Muslims. So this type of rhetoric is called homo-nationalism. And later on, Sarah Ferris developed another concept which is called femo-nationalism, which basically says the same thing about women, that, you know, feminist ideals or values are not appreciated in Islam, so Muslims are a threat to women. Which basically means that all of the people are being lumped together into one category just based on their religion and depicted as a threat to another group's rights. And we kind of became inspired by that, and we tried to coin another term, which we called asimi-nationalism, which is that there are the good, obedient immigrants who are being threatened by, you know, the bad, welfare-seeking immigrants who are going to take the jobs of the good immigrants, so to say. So, for instance, also in the Estonian context, we have the Russian-speaking minority being pitted against the Ukrainian immigrants. So already before the war in Ukraine started, Estonia had a lot of labor migration from Ukraine. And so EKRE was kind of very much against this, and hence also a kind of campaign that, you know, the Ukrainians are not going to take the Estonians' jobs, they are going to take the Russian minorities' jobs. But if we think back to the definition of the populist radical right, then we could play more with the words. You could also threaten a group based on authoritarian values. So we could have homo-authoritarianism or femo-authoritarianism or asimi-populism, for instance, where you have the same group being threatened by something else. Let's say in asimi-populism, you might say that, you know, the ethnic minorities are particularly suffering by the decisions of the ruling elites, for instance. So here are again some examples. Here we have Jimmy Åkesson saying that the Sweden Democrats Party is putting a lot of effort into the safety issue, alleging that LGBT people are even more vulnerable, and making an insinuation that they are particularly threatened by the Muslim minority in Sweden, and that their rights are being kind of threatened, their health and everything. Or then we have EKRE, which is also kind of showing what the Russian community could be threatened by. So you have asimi-authoritarianism. They are trying to appeal to the more conservative value base of the Russian-speaking voters. So they are protecting the traditional family, the children in schools from propaganda and so on, and also from the influx of Ukrainians, for instance. And I think a very spectacular quote on this issue comes from a young man called Fyodor Stomachin. He is a first-generation immigrant from Russia, naturalized Estonian citizen, and a member of EKRE. And this is how he explained why he is in EKRE and why he thinks that EKRE is a good choice for the Russians in Estonia. He says that it seems to me that EKRE has the potential to solve integration issues, but not the way that liberals want to do it. The liberals impose on us the humiliating status of an oppressed minority, just like identity politics does, right? And puts the local Russians in the same category as blacks and transgender people. And his proposal is that you need to recognize the local Russians as an ethnicity, not as a minority, basically saying that ethnic minorities are, of higher rank than racial minorities or gendered minorities, for instance, and that this could be like a desirable paradigm. So, to conclude my argument, I would argue that the radical right is gradually becoming more accepting of the societal de facto pluralism. Maybe it kind of gets vaguely the echoes of the concept of reasonable pluralism by John Rawls. So according to him, societies ought to practice reasonable pluralism, which is kind of acknowledging that there is diversity in the society, and in a society which is governed by the principles of liberty, these different groups just exist and they need to coexist together. But but reasonable pluralism doesn't see that it needs to be, very strongly governed or secondly, I would argue that they are reaching out selectively to certain minority groups, not because they are becoming less nativist or less authoritarian, but in order to further their nativist, authoritarian, or populist agenda. And they're doing this via 4 strategies, so bartering, votes for common interests, politicizing earlier conflicts, or placating minority politicians, or then constructing new hierarchies between or in groups. But its agenda of pluralism is very limited, so it does not see that the coexistence of different groups in the society would require a usually painful dialogue and search for compromise between the interests of different groups. Rather, it is still relatively monist and authoritarian in the way it kind of presents the societal order. So, before I stop, I just want to make one final and maybe the most important point. So, my talk focused on how the populist radical right is performing outreach, trying to seem as reaching out to minority groups. I am not trying to say that minority groups are overwhelmingly supporting populist radical right parties. So there are some groups where you have a considerable level of support, but larger scale studies, for instance, on ethnic minority voters, don't show that this would be very high. Our good colleagues have recently conducted a study across Europe among voters who claim that their religion is Islam, and there they could get the maximum percent of 6%. And this also comes mainly from Eastern European countries. So we're not talking about who Thierry Baudet was, claiming to appeal to. And also in the LGBT community, it tends to vary between 2 to 6% based on the studies that we have. So at least for now, this is like a picture of attempting outreach, but not necessarily resonating on a very broad scale. And I'm also very touchy to like sensationalizing this issue, because I think that we cannot blame the minorities for being reached out to, but rather think about why those parties are performing this outreach. So I will stop here. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. If you have any additional examples to bring, I'm happy to put it in my irregularity file. If you want to stay in touch with the project, then it's called SideStream, and we have a website. And you can find me on social media. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mari-Liis. Javier, do you have... okay.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation, Mari-Liis. I think that the concept of side streaming is quite provocative and suggestive for the audience. And I have a question which is very simple, and is if there is any way to delimit from an ideological point of view or a cultural point of view the limits of these strategic forms of inclusion. I mean, is not the Muslim always or almost always the other? Are all groups equally able to be integrated in the political subject of these parties? Because for me, there seem to be certain constants in the groups that these parties are integrating. Most groups, I seem to think that most groups are accepted as long as they accept the Western values, to summarize. Traditional women, nationalist gays, immigrants but with a Christian background. So maybe, I don't know to what extent it could be reasonable to start calling these parties not anti-immigration parties, but maybe pro-Western parties. Maybe I'm thinking that perhaps the approach that still applies is the one formulated by Samuel Huntington of a class of civilizations. I don't know, it's an idea.
Okay. Thank you very much for this question. Well, overall, I think that the limits for selective inclusion, if you take it from the perspective of theory of populism, are pretty relaxed. So, as Laclau says, basically you can build a chain of equivalence between whoever. We've seen this happen, like having almost surprising groups kind of brought together through, like, different campaign tactics. But I think that the second part of your question relates to, like, the ideological limits or limitations. So from that perspective, I think there needs to be like a justification strategy, like, which relates either to nativism or authoritarianism or populism. So I would argue that it's not necessarily Western values, no. I mean, many radical right parties do have like let's say, they practice an ideology which is also called civilizationalism, that they talk about, let's say, the Western world being challenged, or at dusk, the sun is setting and the West is losing out on everything, and the radical right of the West needs to collectively protect the people. But I wouldn't say that they are very much kind of limited by this. So in many cases, you have this coalition built around authoritarian values. And I think that this doesn't really necessarily correlate with what you had in mind as Western values. So some radical right politicians, yes, like to practice this kind of homo-nationalism or femo-nationalism. Others rather try to unite around being against the rights of the gendered minorities, for instance. So I think it's a very flexible concept, and the only limitation I would set is when the party ceases from being a radical right party. So when we already have a party which is kind of like making substantial revisions to its ideological stances regarding nativism or authoritarianism or populism, then it's already kind of moving into a different category.
Okay. In case that if it's in Spanish, you have it translated.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Actually, I have a question that it's a follow-up on the previous one. Because what I find very interesting is to try to identify the conditions that explain us why these radical right actors decide to engage with one of these minority groups. And it seems to me that it really depends on how do they define the other. In the case of Estonia, it seems to me that, all right, the foreign is the Russian, and also like this LGBT community agenda, ideology, blah, blah, blah. So then language doesn't become a barrier for doing that. In the case of Sweden, it's more like the Muslim immigrants, so the first approach should be like to engage with women, to engage with LGBT community. The case of the Netherlands is a little bit more puzzling to me, but it also seems that in the case of the Netherlands, the engaging with the LGBT community, with the feminist, it has already happened before, right? So now they are already like on the third step. So I'm particularly interested on the difference between Eastern Europe and Western Europe on this regard, because how you build the other in each of these two regions, it's very different. So I would like to be a little bit interested to listen to that a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about the construction of the other, because this is like the key question. It's not maybe even a question of which group do we want to include, but it's rather who is the threat, like the common enemy that we could unite around. And with the Russian-speaking minority in Estonia, who was the threat, they became like a lesser threat, or ceased to be a threat when, let's say, we started having more diverse immigration to Estonia. So then, ACRA shifted its focus to becoming an anti-immigration party around the time of the European migration crisis. So immigration was not that much of an issue before. But now that they have become an anti-immigration party, it was like possible to reach out to the Russian-speaking voters who weren't like very much a fan of immigration either. So for instance, in the context of the European migration crisis, there were some public opinion polls done about Estonians, the residents of Estonia and their attitudes towards hosting refugees in Estonia. And you could see that the Russian-speaking minority was more conservative there as well. So they were more confident about whether Estonia could do this, what this would do to the society, and so on. So it was kind of like a very good match, right? And I think, like with the example of Forum for Democracy in the Netherlands, I think it's similar, that they are trying to focus more from the immigration issue, which has been an obstacle to reaching out to Muslim voters, to, let's say, the environmental strategy, also their anti-Ukrainian attitude, which is something which I think distinguished them from another radical right party in the Netherlands, the Freedom Party. So now they could kind of also gain public attention to this topic, because, you know, this kind of outreach activities are very attractive to the media, and they can actually talk to a broader audience by, you know, making these kind of provocative statements. And they are very good at provoking, so this is part of like the radical right playbook. Yeah, so that's why I'm also saying that this outreach is not necessarily targeting this group, but actually the voters from other groups. And I wouldn't say that there is like a main distinction is between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. It's about who you define at that moment as the antagonist. Like in Hungary, for instance, increasingly the European Union or George Soros, like whatever groups you can unite around that antagonism, they just go for it.
More. If not, well, I have some problems, you know. Well, of course, I would say that you would subscribe more to Laclau's conception of populism than to Moore's one, because in the end, you know, populism is a political strategy. Well, the only thing that matters is that people can get together in order to fight someone that's considered to be evil or against the good people. Okay? So in that sense, what you call this outreach or performing outreach, in the end, is based mainly on how you define the foe, so the enemy. Right? So, and in that sense, I think the great advantage of some populist parties is really that, and I think here is in fact a distinction between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. I would be more on your line. Is the idea that somehow, you know, when you define the foe as being against your own values as a country, say Marine Le Pen, she decided, you know, the best way to attack Muslim migrants was simply recalling the French that they had the values of the Republic, right? And that, you know, they were tolerant to lesbianism or gays, whatever. So in that sense, what they are is they are reconstructing something which has a racist base in terms of our values versus their values. So if you happen to be a Muslim that believes in our values, join us, right? So that's more or less the idea. Whereas I think in Eastern Europe, because most of the countries have had a recent independence, take the case of Poland, for instance. Ivan Krastev has underlined one thing that is peculiar, you know, about Poland, which is that Poland has become much more nationalistic when, at last, most of its population is ethnically Pole. Never in the history has Poland been as Polish as nowadays. So why do you say we're in danger? We Poles are in danger of surviving. So it's a performance, of course. It's a way how you define your enemy. It's a way how you define the we. And I think there's a distinction because I think it's more identitarian in the East and it's more value-oriented in the West. I'm simplifying, right? Of course, you can mix them both or whatever. And then let's introduce the case of the United States, because it started with Muslims for Trump, which seems to be a contradiction, or blacks for Trump, which is also a contradiction because they are purely nativists. But in a way, I think, you know, the problem is how you deal with cognitive dissonance, right? Which means how can you be capable of establishing an equivalence between your identity as a black and someone who's ready to vote for Trump because he's a white chauvinist. So how do you solve that gap? And I think it's only in those situations where the need to integrate is greater than the need, and then let's say, I would say the need to defend your own identity or your own cultural values or your own, ethnicity, right? So, and that happens a lot, for instance, among Latinos, and particularly among Latino men. so that they badly need to integrate somehow. So they don't want to be considered Latinos. They want to be considered Americans. And in that sense, so we had the discussion before, and I think that that's something that we don't find so easily in other European countries, particularly in those around the Mediterranean, because it's so easy to get back to your homeland. So that, for instance, in Spain, where, you know, when the summer comes, there's this immense river of, you know, stream of cars coming from Central Europe, you know, driving down to Morocco, right, to spend the holidays. So you don't have that as, I mean, in the United States, you didn't have that. You don't have that as easily. If you're a migrant from Asia, for instance, as easily as you have it in Europe. So, so this idea of how to create, how to avoid a cognitive dissonance between those that you want to reach out to and your own party, it's not as easy. I mean, it's only possible under certain conditions, which, well, you said it before, it's only 6%, which I would call extreme. So, but you know, it's a tough subject. I mean, it's not easy to organize, you know, the differences.
Right. Yeah. Where to start?
Well,
so I think.
So you would have to go back to.
Yeah, like many very relevant examples. Yeah. So we started this tour around the world from Poland. Yeah. So yes, Poland, also Hungary, are ethnically very homogeneous societies, but yet you do have like a similar mechanism there. So you don't have, let's say, Muslim immigrants to integrate into the people, but there is a question of gender, for instance. Also, like in Hungary or in Poland, you have had, maybe not for like the mainstream parties have already done it, but even like the more, let's say, radical parties, like the Konfederacja, for instance, in Poland, is slowly starting to kind of get over the gender gap, building on this kind of authoritarian values and showing trad wives, or kind of trying to idealize like a very traditional role for women and showing the women as protagonists in like submissive roles in the society. So you still do have side streaming in Eastern European context as well. Or the easiest thing is, of course, to unite groups based on populism, because it's the most flexible one. You can basically tell anyone that, oh, poor you have been suffering from the poor decisions of the government in power. So now we are, you know, if we get to power, your life will improve. And I think that this was also a very important rationale in the United States, where, let's say, the Muslim Americans who supported Trump, many of them supported him simply because they were dissatisfied with Biden's administration's actions in the war in Gaza. So basically they were just not voting for Trump necessarily, but voting against Biden, right? And this is what Laclau kind of, you know, sees as this kind of like bridging the different groups. Or with the black young men, in their case, it was probably the socioeconomic strain, but also like, you know, this kind of like masculine values which Trump's campaign exuded. That
Anti-woke.
Anti-woke, yeah, exactly. So, so you have like, yeah, different bases to unite people around, and the identity is there just a vehicle. It's not necessarily that, you know, all of these groups are going to be living happily together later, or that they actually voted, you know, for the same things. Why I think that this kind of side streaming strategies can become more universal is that the problems or the crises which the radical right is trying to mobilize on have become a bit more universal. So, like the economic situation is a very egalitarian basis, right? So, like in the United States, they talked a lot about the price of the eggs, for instance, and you buy eggs, like unless you're vegan, you buy eggs regardless of your skin color or religion, right? Yeah, so it can be either like a very general crisis, or you can find some other particular grievance. So in the Latin American, but also in the Spanish context, like one mobilization basis is like criticism towards socialism and socialist politics, which, you know, different groups are being protected from.
Yeah. Well, Vox has one of its leaders is black, as a matter of fact. So in that sense, I mean, they try. Well, I mean, they try to give the impression that they are not.
Yeah, that's placation.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. You want to introduce not just a question, but an opinion? You can speak Spanish, of course. She will be translated. Yeah.
Buenas tardes a todos. Y lo primero que querría es pedir disculpas si puedo entretener a alguien que o se quiera o no se quiera ir. Pero en estos momentos, como mi madre es alemana, yo nací en España, concretamente en Cataluña, y he vivido en muchas partes. He tenido becas en Viena, he tenido por allá, y conozco un poco lo que suele pasar. Sin embargo, en la discusión que estáis proponiendo, que es un tinglao muy complicado, en donde creo que se olvidan factores muy importantes, entre ellos concretamente el valor económico y de racista y de pueblo. Por ejemplo, yo he nacido en Tarragona. No hablo naturalmente catalán porque hablo el castellano y hablo el alemán como el español, casi igual, bilingüe. Y entonces, por ejemplo, tengo unas hijas que son aperturistas y, por ejemplo, estaban trabajando en Cataluña, y por eso estoy hablando aquí, para que la gente sea consciente del no pluralismo, sino del papanismo de los nacionalistas, que no buscan ni siquiera la calidad de su idioma, comprender como, por ejemplo, mis amigos y parientes, los catalanes, sino que, por ejemplo, los catalanes han prohibido, y están todos los suramericanos que no han contratado a nadie porque hablan como nosotros el castellano, tienen la misma religión y tienen muchas virtudes que el gran imperio, incluido el español, han respetado. Yo, por ejemplo, voy a contar una anécdota que puede ser un poco tonta, y si me permites, alguien que levante la mano y me voy inmediatamente. Yo, por ejemplo, en Alemania, cuando viví, que desde los 9 a los 13 años, era un español. Y entonces, cuando los gimnasios en Schleswig-Holstein, etcétera, se enteraban de que había un español, los profesores, y concretamente los de latín, me acuerdo, que hablaba del héroe. Tenemos un héroe español. El concepto de España era maravilloso porque no hemos sido ni racistas, ni colonialistas, ni hemos sido nada. Ninguna de estas virtudes anglosajones las hemos disfrutado nosotros. Y entonces me miraban todos los compañeros, y yo, como tenía entonces 9, 10, 11, 12 años, me daba rabia de estar de pie y que todos me miraran así de lado. Porque yo, que no era madrileño todavía para decir tacos, y yo solamente quiero recordar que yo me preguntaba, ¿pero qué demonios me importa a mí todo esto si yo quiero que me dejen en paz, que no soy ningún héroe? ¿Comprendes? Era un concepto que había de la gran España, ¿entiendes? Que fueran las primeras universidades del mundo, cuando los ingleses o los Boyers o los otros ni se han acercado a la suela de los españoles. Me revelo de que mis hijas, por ejemplo, que son muy monas, muy ricas y muy buenas hijas, pues resulta que no las dejen trabajar en el Estartite, por ejemplo, en Cataluña, porque no saben el catalán.
Sí, pero perdone
Sí.
que le interrumpa, pero realmente ¿cuál es la pregunta?
Pues que esta cosita de los nacionalismos, etcétera, también tiene una parte económica y una parte de paleto. de paleto que no dejan que los demás ocupen los puestos políticos. Es decir, que los idiomas se han convertido en una segregación de los pueblos. O sea, que hay un concepto mayor, que es el idioma. Y, por ejemplo, cuando yo, he acabado viviendo como arquitecto en Asturias, etcétera, y entonces había dos puertas. Y me decían, por ejemplo, señores y señoras, etcétera, en inglés, que no lo quiero hablar, naturalmente. Yo no quiero hablar en inglés, porque para eso sé un idioma alemán que me resulta más rico, más frondoso que el maldito inglés, que solamente saben manejar el infinitivo. ¿Entiendes? Y entonces decían en inglés, en español, en francés, y tal, señores y señoras, la próxima estación va a ser, por ejemplo, la que sea, no quiero decir ahora.
Sí, pero perdone que le interrumpa.
Bueno, me callo ya, vale.
Sí, no es por callarle, es simplemente por no desviarnos del tema que estamos discutiendo, porque usted lo que quiere introducir es una discusión más amplia sobre el nacionalismo en particular, que me parece muy interesante, pero que esta noche no es lo que estamos discutiendo. No, yo no le quito la palabra, perdón, no. Sí, yo comprendo que usted tenga una queja porque ha sufrido un nacionalismo radical, pero... Sí, pero la cuestión hoy es... Sí, pero el moderador soy yo. Como usted comprenderá, quien lleva... Bueno, sí, pero bueno, le repito, eso no es la discusión de hoy. Hoy no estamos hablando de nacionalismo, sino de cómo los partidos populistas, que algunos son nacionalistas, otros pueden tener un carácter, pueden ser izquierdistas, por ejemplo, cómo los partidos populistas buscan conectar con grupos minoritarios, que es algo que a priori parece que no es tan sencillo, ¿no? Ok, pero bueno, respeto, por supuesto, su opinión sobre el tema.
If I may, I think it's actually like an interesting example of a cultural cleavage, in a way, which relates to language skills. So this can be kind of like one of these issues which can be used to mobilize around. So I think it's an interesting example. And it reminds me of work which has also been done among linguistically distinct regions, where you also have like the local majority, who is a minority on the national level, but a majority in their region, who is often feeling threatening because the immigrants who come, for instance, in Bolzano in Italy, so there is, it's also a German-speaking region, but when, let's say, Romanian immigrants come there, they usually learn Italian because they're in Italy. And this has become a topic for some of the local, more populist politicians who are trying to, mobilize voters around these kind of grievances, because this is relevant for many people. And I understand that in Spain as well, like the linguistic differences within the country as well, they can also be used as these grievances for mobilization.
Okay, Javier, yeah.
There are a couple of questions from the online audience. First, Mercedes Fadrique asks the following question. Don't you think that part of the success of these strategies of inclusion depend on making individuals from these minority groups feel special?
Yes.
And up to what extent this is linked to individualism and the feeling of not recognizing yourself as part of the group? This is the first question. Mm-hmm. And the second question by José María Sauca is, he says that I will have a methodological consideration to your analysis, because if I understand you correctly, you analyze the explicit discourse of the parties to understand or determine what is the ideology that they have. Mm-hmm. And this approach presupposes the sincerity in their discourse. And I wonder whether this assumption might not somewhat naive up to some extent, because the parties that do not have to be necessarily sincere and may have discourses to attract the support of the people, so propaganda in a way, while they have an underlying agenda that is contrary to their interests.
Yeah, thank you. Very good questions. So on the first one, I think it's very beautifully formulated. Absolutely, yeah. So it allows some people potentially to distance, like from a group identity. I don't have to be the Russian, you know. I can be an Estonian patriot. When I'm voting for this party, then, you know, I'm an Estonian patriot first and maybe Russian second or third or fifth. So it kind of might be, you know, liberating for these people as well. But I'm saying kind of and might be because we are still working on the demand side. So we are kind of trying to understand the effects.
Yeah?
Okay, great. Yeah. So the first question was about individualism and or whether this kind of, it's still not working?
No.
Okay. Sorry. Okay, now I can continue. Yes, okay. So the first question was about individualism, and I was saying that definitely that side streaming gives, or at least my hypothesis is that side streaming can give like a strategy for renegotiating your individual identity. As being a Russian in Estonian, which is like often scapegoated and so on. If you're voting for this party, you can try to put your identity as Estonian patriot first. Say like, you know, I was born a Russian, but you know, first and foremost, I'm an Estonian patriot and I'm voting for this party to show it. But this is still kind of like a hypothesis. We still want to test this, and we are going to be working on some experiments on this. But you know, as a hypothesis, I guess it, and based on previous works, it seems to apply. We've seen this also in other studies. For instance, studies conducted in Switzerland, which show that the longer a person with a migration background has lived in the country, the more likely they are to vote for nationalist parties or support, you know, similar kind of ideologies. So this might also be related to the fatigue effect, that I don't want to be the immigrant anymore. I want to be accepted as, you know, part of the nation. Regarding sincerity, and we have used this word a lot in the discussions on the project as well. Of course, I don't assume that this is necessarily sincere. I'm not ruling it out, but in many cases, it probably is not. And this is why we're not saying that these parties reach out to minority voters, but rather that they are performing outreach or trying to appear as, you know, reaching out to the minority group. So it can easily be a spectacle, which is not even put up for the minority itself, but actually to the, let's say, the ethnic majority voter, for instance, who doesn't want to look racist or xenophobic. And hence, if they can say that, oh, but this party also has, you know, a black politician in it, I can't be racist, then this is like a legitimization strategy for their ethnic majority voters instead. But as I said, we're still kind of testing the effects, so you can invite me back in a year. Maybe I have more information on the societal effects or how this is received by the voters.
Okay, we'll invite you back. Don't worry. La última, the last one, because we're running out of time. Two, again? Okay. No, go ahead.
Just two small issues. First one, I think that when we are talking about all these people, we are always assuming that if they are women, black, etc., that's, as you already went into that a little bit, that we assume that those attributes is their first and foremost. defining identity, and they will base their behavior based on that. And I mean, from an intersectionality point of view, there is other things that go on. So I mean, if you can be a little bit more critical on that. And second, and this example came to my mind because of the gentleman's previous question, was that I can give you two examples about how identity is framed in Spain. And one is Vox, and the other is Alianza Catalana. Vox has...
The other is what?
Alianza Catalana.
Alianza Catalana.
With both parties, you have like a very interesting phenomena. In the case of Vox, you have the other who is the migrant, but of course, it's also a Spanish nationalist party, so you cannot really go against the Spanish-speaking immigrants. So they have always been on a very interesting act of balancing between both identities, and that goes a little bit also, I think, in your direction. On the other case, they have used feminism, they have used LGBT as a much more stronger enemy, adversary, etc. In the case of Alianza Catalana, they have, and this is actually my own research, they have two enemies, the Muslim migrant and the Spanish state. And they have to build on both. And what we are seeing is that on the opposite, what they are using now is they are using very clearly homo-nationalism and femo-nationalist rhetoric to compensate for the other two, just as two little examples that you can add to your data. So thank you very much for the talk.
Okay, well, these are very interesting examples. So yeah, good to add. I didn't catch your question.
About so this assumption that we have that because they have gender, sexuality,
oh, right, yeah.
ethnicity,
the primacy of the identities.
This is like their most important things in their life.
Yeah.
And we know that's not, so you can be a little bit more critical on that.
Absolutely, yeah. I very much agree, yeah. So for like many women, for instance, we have studies showing that this is not like the first identity necessarily for females. Especially when they vote. But we can't negate that there is a gender gap. So the radical right parties are called the Männerparteien, the parties of men, for men, and by men, right? So their candidates, their ideology, their voters tend to be male. And in order to kind of legitimize, they perform outreach towards women, even if, like, you know, this isn't like the primary identity of the voters. In some other cases, I would say the same. I mean, race in the US politics tends to be, especially for African Americans, it tends to be like the primary identity. So studies have shown that this is like the first cue that black voters use when they're kind of making their choices in elections. But it kind of seems to me that this time around, it wasn't that much related to race. So this is like an interesting change. Meanwhile, among the Latino voters, you can also build like these hierarchies of identities within the Latino group, for instance. So support for Trump was, which way was it? The support for Trump in the last election was higher among Latino voters who did not identify as Latino or as Mexican, who identified as Colombian, for instance, or Venezuelan or Cuban. Identification plays a role, definitely, in like how effective site streaming is. So I think it's a good point, but at the same time, like if you're trying to perform outreach, then like for the rest of the society, it's like a marker of somebody else, and you know, it serves a purpose anyway.
Okay, thank you very much, Mari-Liis. It's been a pleasure having you with us tonight. And the switch to Spanish. Y muchísimas gracias a todos ustedes por haber seguido este seminario. Creo que han sido 4 lunes bastante intensos, y lo que esperamos es que hayamos conseguido aclararles algunas dudas o crearles otras, que tampoco es mala estrategia. El año que viene vendremos con otro con otro tema, siempre relacionado con la democracia y la tolerancia. Muchísimas gracias por su presencia, de verdad.
Okay, thanks so much.